Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of the Sheffield Machine Learning Seminar Series. We return after a somewhat longish summer break and autumn break, let's say. We're very pleased to welcome here Kate Rakelly, who's doing her PhD. Actually, she's wrapping up. She's got her defense in a few weeks coming up at the University of California, Berkeley, at the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Laboratories and she's advised by Sergey Levin. And she also works with Alyosha Ifros and Trevor Darrell. Earlier, she did her bachelor's in electrical engineering and computer science, also from UC Berkeley. And she's also done undergrad research with Shari Ginosar and Alyosha Ifros in computer vision, as well as Insoon Yang and Claire Tomlin in control. So welcome again, Kate, and she'll be talking to us on an inference perspective in meta-learning. And the floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen now, and we'll get started. Okay, does everyone see that?
Yep, I think that's great.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, thank you for having me, and happy Thanksgiving from the United States. My name is Kate, and I'm going to talk today. My talk today is going to be about how we can view meta-learning as learning to infer, and how I think this perspective is a really fruitful and interesting one in terms of solving existing problems in meta-learning. So, as we're all really familiar with, deep learning approaches have been really effective in some domains, from object recognition there on the bottom to playing games, and even simple object grasping when given enough training data. However, the agents we train are specialists. They can only really succeed on a very narrow task under a narrow set of conditions. And of course, they require a lot of training data. So as an example, here's on the top, the COCO image recognition data set, which was hand labeled by humans, 80,000 labels with those detailed polygon pixelized labels. And in the field of reinforcement learning, the story is even worse, where we need millions of interactions with the environment to learn a good policy. So on the other hand, if we look at, for example, young children for inspiration, they're really great at picking up new skills and reusing what they've already learned to quickly acquire new skills with kind of minimal guidance from adults or peers. And so with this as inspiration, in meta-learning, we're going to try to endow artificial agents with this same ability. So now I'd like to introduce a little bit of formalism for meta-learning that we'll use throughout the talk. So let's start with the kind of classic supervised image classification setup. And so in this setup, what we have is a set of classes for the classified images. And during meta training, we're going to assume that we have access to a bunch of these classes that are all labeled. And then what we'd like to do at meta test time is be able to take a few labeled examples from some new classes and then be able to correctly classify examples from those classes. So in some formalism, we'll say that to adapt to a new task indexed by I, we'll define this function fi that summarizes the training data into what I'm going to call zi, which right now is kind of a vague object. And that zi will adapt the model to the task. So then in the upper line, you can see that we're going to take the loss of that adapted model on the test data. And we want to minimize that loss across all of the meta training tasks that we have. So the key idea of this talk is that we, in meta learning, we can often think of that function fi as a learning algorithm, right? Maybe it's gradient descent or something like that. But what I'm going to propose is that instead we should think of it as inference. So we should think of it as inference of some hidden task information that we can then use to condition the model to adapt it to our task. So the first project I'm going to talk about is taking this idea and applying it to doing few-shot image segmentation. And this was joint work with Evan, Trevor, Alyosha, and Sergey. So what does few-shot learning look like for image segmentation? So first thing to know about image segmentation is that the labels are really expensive. As I kind of alluded to earlier, you need to have a person sit down and actually, label every pixel that you want to predict, which is much harder than just giving a label for an image. So it can take a human up to 20 minutes to actually annotate one of these scenes. And on top of that, there's a lot of applications where you might actually need a domain expert. So you can't just get anyone to provide labels, but you need, say a radiologist or an ecologist or so on. And it's especially hard to collect this kind of data for every object thanks to the problem of the long tail, right? Where some objects are extremely common, but most objects are really rare. So even just finding that, even if we could annotate all of it, even just getting the example for everything that we want to be able to recognize is itself a challenge. So one thing that would really ease the burden of segmentation annotation is if instead of requiring these pixel-wise annotations, if we could just require single point annotations. So basically the thing on the right instead of the thing in the middle. So you can imagine this would be a lot faster to annotate, and you could annotate a lot more images if you could just kind of click and say, this is a car, this is a tree, and so on. Okay, so before we talk about how we're going to do meta-learning in this setting, I first just want to talk a little bit about how image segmentation models actually work. So just the kind of bare bones of it is that we have a fully convolutional network, or FCN, which maps pixel inputs from the images to pixel outputs via convolutional layers. So it's really similar to an image classification network, except that you preserve the spatial map of the activations rather than passing them through that fully connected layer to predict the single class. And the network is trained by just taking the cross entropy loss for each pixel between the predicted segmentation image and the ground truth image. So this idea of segmenting, from point-wise annotations isn't actually new. It was something that was called interactive segmentation. And the idea here was that interactive segmentation allows you to interact and correct the model, right? So if I want to segment this image of a woman on a horse, I can, click some annotations on and then get my segmentation. But the problem here is that you have to interact with every image, right? There's not a notion of actually learning the task of let's say I want to segment horses or people, and then being able to apply that to other images, which is what we're after. So to recap, here's what we'd like to be able to do. So we want to take, this new class, say here of dogs that has a few annotations on it that are those sparse, cheap kind of point-wise annotations. And then we want to be able to use that supervision to learn how to perform that same task in new images. So for example, how to segment the dog in this brand new image here that has no annotations on it. And the approach we're going to take that I alluded to before is we're going to first infer task information from that supervision that we have that we're calling guidance here with that function f5, and then use that task information to adapt our segmentation model to performing that task on new images. And so now I'll talk about how each of these components is designed. So first, that F5 component. So how should we extract task information from this image and annotations? So the idea is really simple. What we're going to do is just first extract image features from the image via convolutional layers, and then just multiply the annotations by those image features to create kind of masks, right, per class. So in this case, when we multiply with the positive annotations, we'll get a kind of mask that picks out the dog features in the image. And then we'll just pool across those features. So you can think of it as we're getting like a prototype latent vector for the thing that we want to segment. Okay, so this idea that I just described leads to a kind of interesting phenomenon where what we're really doing is we're getting a kind of global across the whole image notion of what the task is. And so I think this is a really nice kind of comparison of it. So imagine you have this image of these 3 water birds, and you draw some annotations of that you put some positive annotations on the upper left bird. So if you take the approach of simply concatenating all of the images and annotations together and just feeding it through the model, you might get something that looks like this example here, where you just segment that bird that you annotated. So basically, you get like a local propagation of the supervision. But if you use this late fusion model, instead what you get is you'll actually segment everything with those same semantics in the image, right? So we'll actually segment all of the seabirds versus just the local one. So the choice of which one you want to do could depend on, if your task, you care more about semantics, or if you actually care about, local like location properties in the image. Okay, so here's now how the full model fits together. So I just described how that task information is extracted from the guidance, which is F5 on the top. And then the architecture of how we actually use that to predict the new segmentation is we just simply concatenate the features together from the task information and from the new image to be segmented, and we perform some more convolutions to predict the output. This isn't the only choice. You could also, do something where the task information predicts the parameters of the segmentation model that predicts then the output. But we just found this kind of really simple concatenation thing to work the best. Okay, so that's the model. And now we can ask, how can we train this model given standard segmentation data sets? And so the cool thing is we can just synthesize these tasks from already labeled data sets. So the way we do that is we take the semantic segmentation labels, we binarize them for a given class, and then we just sample some sparse annotation points from those classes. And so this is, we did this with the Pascal data set, and we get annotations that kind of look like this. And then with those kind of generated tasks, we can train our model here end to end. So again, it's just like in the regular FCN model where we're taking that pixelized cross entropy between the prediction and the target. And now we're just training both the F phi and the F theta. So this model that we proposed subsumes a few different segmentation problems that were usually kind of thought about separately, right? So it's like semantic segmentation, where you want to segment the same semantic category, interactive segmentation, where you want to, in real time, correct the segmentation of the object, and then also video object segmentation, where you might get a few annotations on a few frames and then want to segment the entire video. So in all of these situations, we can do this with the same model. So here's just some quantitative results of our model, and these are pretty old at this point, so the numbers probably don't mean very much. But I guess the one thing that I would point out is that the model was really, really fast. So you can see that in the plot in the lower right-hand corner where, so basically ballpark is that our method is here in blue and some other methods are in orange, and the x-axis is the time needed to infer each frame. And the reason that it was really fast is because, again, we can use that the late fusion technique where we only have to extract the image features once, and then if the annotations change, it's just a simple multiplication to change the output, right? Because we don't need to recompute the image features. And then let me see if this will play. This is just an example of the model running on some videos. So the bottom is the ground truth segmentation, and the top is the segmentation produced by our model. And I would say that segmentation models are much better now than they were back then. So these results don't look that great anymore. But and then I'll just point out again, if I can go back there. Let's see. So you can see that global, here we go, here's a good example of it, that global versus local propagation thing is happening, where here where we saw the two cars, it segmented both cars, right? Because the cars look very similar and it's transferring just that semantic representation of the task. Okay, cool. So that's that was that project. And now I'd like to go back to, so that was kind of looking at just the perception problem, right? At a kind of passive prediction model that is just making these kind of passive predictions. But what about agents that actually interact with the world? So, what about these RL agents that are playing games or picking up objects? So I just like to quickly talk about, so action creates this feedback loop, right, where the actions you take then affect the next things that happen, and then those affect the next actions that you take, right? And so reinforcement learning is one way to formalize the setting, and so I just want to really quickly go through that setup for anyone who's not familiar. So at each time step, right, the agent's going to take an action, and the environment responds with a new state and reward. And we don't usually know the dynamics of how the environment changes with each action. So all we can really observe about it are the states and the rewards that are emitted. And the actions that the agent takes, we call this the policy. And this is the thing that we get to pick, right, that we get to change in order to change the outcome. So the agent's goal in this framework is to maximize the cumulative rewards over its lifetime, what we call the return. And one thing to note about this goal is that it requires both exploration, so figuring out, trying out new things to figure out which ones are good, and also exploitation. So, once you figure out what's good, keep doing those things. And of course, there's a lot of RL algorithms and a lot of ideas there. So I just mention a few concepts that are kind of really common and across all of them. So, the first object is the policy, which is what to do, right? It's the distribution of actions given the state. The second idea is the value function. So the idea that we want to be able to predict future rewards, or how good is it to be here, right? How good is it to be in this state taking this action? So that's the expected sum of rewards that you would get from the future from this state. And the third idea is a model, which is saying, let's model what the environment will do. So let's try to predict, what the next state would be, or what the reward would be at the next time step. And from these components, you can kind of imagine how you might start designing RL algorithms. For example, if you've learned a model of the environment, then you could do some search in order to maximize return. Of course, if you learned a value function, then to get a policy, you can just choose the action with the maximum value, right, from each state. So we won't really need a lot of details about reinforcement learning algorithms for most of the ideas in this talk. Okay, so now let's go back to the formalism we had before and kind of add the RL problem into it. So as we recall, we had this F5 function, which was summarizing the task information into ZI, and then ZI was going to adapt our prediction model. Okay, so now let's map this onto the reinforcement learning problem. So now, instead of training data, we get data from that's given by humans. We get training data from some new MDP, right? And then the task information ZI is now going to adapt a policy rather than a classification model. And our outer objective now is to maximize the return, as we talked about earlier. So some terminology we generally call the F5 function, adaptation or the inner loop. And there's lots of different design choices for what this part can be. And then we often call the meta training phase or the outer loop. And this is pretty much always, gradient descent on the objective, whether we're doing, image classification or deep reinforcement learning. Okay, so what's different about this RL setting, besides just the kind of mechanics of it? So exploration is a new challenge, right, when we're applying meta learning to reinforcement learning. In the supervised learning case, the data was labeled and provided to us by a human, right? But in RL, the agent actually has to collect its own data in the new task. And so the kind of task information that you'll collect, the ZI that you'll be able to figure out, is dependent on how you explore and collect that data. So the problem of exploration is now central to the meta learning problem. Okay, so just like we did for the segmentation problem, I want to propose that we go about tackling this via inference. So to understand this in the RL setting, here's a graphical model depiction of the meta RL problem. So we have our states, xt, which produce rewards, right? We have actions that transition us from state to state. And all of the transitions between states and the rewards are influenced by this hidden task variable tau. So you can think of tau as kind of indexing different MDPs, right, that have some shared structure in their dynamics and their reward function. And so again, the same solution I'd like to propose is that we solve the meta RL problem by inferring this latent task variable from experience, and then using that latent task variable to adapt our policy. Okay, so I think this proposal sounds reasonable, but does it allow us to solve existing problems in meta RL? So I'll give two examples of problems that it has helped us solve. So first of all, off-policy meta RL. By off-policy, I mean that the meta objective is optimized with an off-policy RL algorithm. And this is a really important capability because off-policy RL algorithms are much more sample efficient than their on-policy counterparts. So if we're interested in having these meta RL systems run in the real world, we really need to be able to leverage that off-policy data. So to understand why off-policy meta RL is challenging, first, let's go back again to supervised learning and consider this example. So it's common wisdom, right, that the conditions at training time should closely match the conditions at test time. So if you meta train on tasks classifying different types of dogs, for example, you're not going to do very well under a test time distribution of classifying motorbikes. But you'll probably do fine if your test distribution is another type of dog. And so it's the same story in RL, where during meta training, right, we want to be able to leverage this off-policy data. But at test time, we're going to be running the current policy, right, to explore and adapt to a new task. And so that presents this kind of distribution shift between training and test time. One note of caution here is I'd just like to mention that this question of why off-policy meta-RL is so difficult is still a pretty open question. And what I'm describing is kind of one hypothesis about it. So the solution I'm going to describe for this problem is called Pearl, and this was joint work with Oric, Deirdre, Chelsea, and Sergey, and this was published at ICML 2019 last year. Okay, so how can that inference perspective help us here? So the graphical model is suggesting that we think of adapting to a task, right, as inferring this latent variable tau. And how this connects to off-policy RL is that this allows us to separate the problem of identifying the task from the problem of behaving optimally in that task. So this gives us a way to tackle that problem, right? Because now we can use off-policy data. Oops. Now we can use off-policy data to train the policy while still using that on-policy data to infer the task. Okay, so now how can we build a practical algorithm from this intuition? So we're going to call the experience that we've seen in the task so far, so that's all of your states, actions, and rewards. We'll call that C for context. And so what we'd like to do is infer a distribution over a latent task variable, which we'll call Z, given that context C. And so we'll do this via variational inference, and that's the objective that I've written here. So this is the evidence lower bound, which has, is the first this likelihood term of the objective we'd like to maximize, and then this information bottleneck or regularization term that is kind of constraining our task posterior to prior distribution. So the term that we're going to choose for the likelihood term is going to be the Bellman error, which in the control as inference framework, we can kind of interpret as a likelihood. But I think the more intuitive way to think about it is as kind of an information bottleneck. So what this objective is saying is we'd like to be able to predict the Q values accurately while minimizing the amount of information needed to do so, right? So just extract the task relevant information into that Z variable such that we can predict Q values. Okay, so here's how the idea of the latent task belief fits in with a reinforcement learning algorithm. In this case, we're going to use soft actor critic as the RL algorithm, but the details of that aren't really important. It's just important that it is able to use off-policy data. But in an actor-critic algorithm, you have both the critic here, which is the Q function, and the actor, which is the policy. So that's why they're both pictured here. So the way the algorithm works is we sample some data from a whole set of meta training tasks, and then we use that variational, we infer the variational posterior, right, which was Q of Z given context. And then we're able to sample from that posterior and feed those samples to the actor and the critic. So the policy is operating given samples from our latent task belief. So a natural question is, how often should we update this belief, right? How should that Z variable be sampled from the posterior distribution? So one really neat thing about this algorithm design is that latent task variable Z gives us a way to tackle the exploration problem. And we can do that by just holding that Z variable constant across an episode. So here's kind of the difference. So on the left, if you have non-correlated noise as input to your policy, right, you might not do anything coherent. Whereas on the right, if we kind of hold that noise variable constant across an episode, that will bias the policy towards these kind of temporally extended exploration strategies. And of course, this idea of structured input noise is not a new one, and it was applied previously meta-RL in the Mason paper, and then previous to that for skill learning in the stochastic neural networks paper. But the new idea here is that that variable now represents the task. So it's not just a technique for exploration, it also kind of represents the task that you're doing. And so that means that in this context, that holding the task variable constant has kind of another interpretation, which is as posterior sampling. So posterior sampling, or Thompson sampling, I think as it's more commonly called, refers to acting optimally according to a random sample that you drew from the belief. So here's an example of how that works in the context of the algorithm. So suppose you have this point robot here that starts at the gray dot and navigates to different goal locations on the half circle. And it only gets a reward when it's within a small radius of the goal. So during meta training, it will learn a prior over goals that consists of the half circle. And then at test time, given a new goal, like this one here shown in blue, it can explore by taking a guess about the goal location and then iteratively refining that guess via posterior sampling over time as it collects more data. And so you can see here, it's able to smoothly transition from this exploration behavior to this exploitation behavior once it's found the goal. Okay, so now I'm going to show some results from this algorithm on some simulated meta-RL problems. And in each of these environments, so we vary either the reward function, so such as the speed that the cheetah needs to run at, or the direction that the ant robot should run in, or we vary the dynamics distribution, so such as the joint parameters of the walker robot here on the right. And so these are the two ways that MDPs can vary, right, in dynamics or in rewards. Okay, so here's the results of the prior work to Perl on each of the environments. And I've plotted the results on a log scale because these algorithms are pretty inefficient. And so you can really see how many samples each of these algorithms is using. And then here's the result of the Perl algorithm, which we just talked about, which uses 20 to 100 times fewer samples in the baselines depending on the environment, and also generally has much better performance. And so this sample efficiency speed up, even though the numbers are still large, it's a pretty big deal because if we do a kind of back of the envelope calculation about what this would mean running on a real system, the baselines would require about a month of training, and our algorithm would require about 24 hours. So this was really exciting for us because it kind of signaled that we were close to being able to put one of these meta-RL algorithms on a real system. Okay, so excuse me. All right, so again, driving towards this goal of getting these algorithms on a real system. Another major stumbling block to making this happen, besides the sample efficiency, is dealing with sensory observations. So when you're in a simulator, of course, the underlying state of the system is exposed, right? Whereas in the real world, the robot has to make decisions based on its sensors, like its cameras, force sensors, etc. So for example, consider this robot tasked with performing maintenance in a data center. So the robot needs to be able to insert cables of different shapes, sizes, and colors into different locations and orientations. And it needs to do all that, again, operating just from those sensors. So while in principle, we can run RL end-to-end from raw observations, in practice, this typically doesn't work very well at all. So the solution I'm going to present for this problem is called MELD, and this was joint work with Tony, Anusha, and then again, Chelsea and Sergey. Okay, so thinking about this problem of learning from observations, An effective alternative to end-to-end training in RL is to make use of latent state models to infer the underlying state of the system. So state estimation can be achieved via unsupervised learning of these models. And what I mean by that is we want to infer the latent state Z from a history of observations X. And these approaches summarize information from the high-dimensional inputs into a much more compact and lower-dimensional representation. And they also help us address partial observability by aggregating information over time, right? So if you're an agent operating from images, each single image that you receive might not have all the information that you need to choose the optimal action at that time step. And so the structure of these models allows you to aggregate information from multiple images over time in order to make that decision. So the key idea of this project is that we can take that task variable tau that I introduced before and now just interpret it as part of the hidden state variable Z that we were going to estimate anyway using the latent state model. So what this means is that we can easily repurpose existing latent state models to do meta-reinforcement learning. And so that's why we call the algorithm MELD, because it's kind of melding these two frameworks together. Okay, so here's the recipe for turning a latent state model into a meta-learning algorithm. First thing you need to do is concatenate the reward to the observation. And so this is so that that latent state that we're going to learn can capture both task and state information. Second, we need to persist that latent state across episode boundaries. And this is so that the task information can be aggregated across multiple trials. Right, so if the agent explores during one trajectory, we want it to be able to use that information that it gathered in the next trajectory. And then the third thing is we need to train the latent state model across a set of training tasks drawn from some distribution. Right, so for example, if we have a task distribution of inserting Ethernet cables into a router, we would want to draw meta-training tasks from this distribution. Okay, so we could use different latent state model algorithms to do this, but we chose to build on top of the SLAC latent state model algorithm. And what SLAC does is it uses a sequential variational autoencoder to infer the latent state, and then uses this state as input to the SAC RL algorithm that we saw earlier. So the model is trained by maximizing, again, variational inference, by maximizing the elbow. Which here consists of, again, we have the two terms. So here the likelihood term is the reconstruction, so the autoencoding of the image and rewards, and then the regularization terms that make the learned posterior match the learned dynamics model. Right. So what I've written here is the objective for a latent state model. And so the only change we have to make to do meta learning, again, is to just replace that observation X with the observation and the reward. Okay, so putting it all together, here's a training diagram of the algorithm. So the learned latent belief, right, over the state and task, Q phi, is passed as input to the actor critic. And we optimize the actor critic and the model all together with batches of trajectories from the Rakelly buffer. And then at test time, MELD acquires a new skill via posterior inference in the learned model. Okay, so here's some results of this algorithm on some simulated domains. And this time, the observations are not the ground truth state of the agent, right, but the images that you see here. So in these tasks, the cheetah needs to run at the correct speed, the robot needs to insert the peg in the correct hole, and in the third environment, the robot has to place a mug in the correct place on the shelf. And so we compare it to the algorithm I just described, Perl, as a baseline, as well as a couple other meta-learning algorithms. And I'm plotting the results here. And I'm plotting the kind of qualitative task success with a dashed black line. So you can see that none of the existing algorithms are able to solve the task. And then here's the result of the MELD algorithm. Okay, so in the previous experiments that I just showed you, the task was identifiable given rewards from just a few time steps of experience. But in more realistic scenarios, the robot might require much longer to figure out the task. So in this environment, the robot receives a reward only when the correct button is pressed, which is that indicated with the white dot for visualization. And during, excuse me. So for analysis here, what I'm doing is predicting the distance from the robot's end effector to the correct button, given the latent state at each time step. And that's plotted in red. And the true distance is plotted in black. And so now what we can see is, so here's the robot exploring. So in the top image, this is the first episode. And as we can see, it kind of explores each button in a sequence in order to find the right one. And if we look at what the predicted distance is to the goal, right, we can see it decreasing with each button that's explored, and then finally reducing to 0 once the robot finds the correct button. And now, finally, we're going to demonstrate that this algorithm enables the WidowX robot arm in the real world to perform a similar insertion task. So here, the task distribution consists of the location and orientation of this router, as well as which port we should insert into. And to instrument these tasks, we build an automatic reset mechanism that moves the router. And just like in the button experiment I just showed you, the reward is only given when the cable is correctly inserted into the Ethernet port. So what the robot learns to do is first explore one port and then the other. So here, for example, it explores the left one, which is incorrect, and then it finds the correct hole on the second episode. And here in a different task, the left hole happens to be the correct hole. Okay, so in the last minute or so that I have, looking towards future work, I think that this framework of meta-learning as inference will allow us to more generally use tools from both probabilistic inference and representation learning directly in the world of meta-learning. And I think what this might allow us to do is deal with challenges in optimization, supervision, and generalization for meta-RL algorithms. And I think I'm out of time, so I might just skip through a few examples of how I think that can be done, unless there's a question about it, and just go straight to here are the takeaway slides. So in summary, we can think of meta-learning as doing probabilistic inference. And we saw how this perspective is useful in really quite diverse problems, I think, from few-shot image segmentation all the way to doing meta-reinforcement learning from images. And I think the most exciting thing about all this is the fact that it gives us a kind of principled perspective, a principled way to think about the future challenges in meta-RL. So with that, I'll pause here and feel free to ask me some questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Great talk, great work. We are still waiting for a few questions. And so maybe I can just ask while we wait for some more. So could you kind of let's say, summarize the differences between the two MELD? So one difference, of course, is one is kind of in my simple language, let's say model-based versus model-free. There's a latent state model. Mm-hmm. And if you just add reward to the latent state model, you can convert it into meta RL, apparently. Mm-hmm. That was the key takeaway. And I'm not sure if the second one, MELD, is also off policy like Perl, or you can just apply the same techniques of Perl to that as well. So are these the basic differences, or would you like to add something or clarify a bit more on that?
Yeah, so the MELD algorithm is also off policy. So we use off policy data to train the latent state model and the soft vector critic RL agent. Yeah, I would say that, so there is this kind of salient difference between the two, where in the MELD project, we need to infer state information. So we actually need to process those observations in a kind of sequential model in order to infer the state information. And so we need to update the latent state at every time step in order to get that updated latent state information. Whereas in the Perl model, we were able to instead use that latent variable and hold it constant across the episode to get the temporally extended exploration. So I guess I'd say one kind of drawback to the MELD approach is that we lose that kind of temporally extended exploration that we were, in a sense, kind of getting for free from the Perl algorithm. And we did find that in experiments that exploration was more of an issue in the MELD setting. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that answers, but it also raises, as in, do you need to, can't you just also keep the MELD Z, the latent state? No, you can't, I guess it's getting inferred. But you could somehow try to force it to be more constant.
Yeah, I think you could imagine an algorithm where you separate the kind of task information from the state information. And that would allow you to improve the exploration properties.
Oh, yeah.
But the point we kind of wanted to make in this project was that you don't have to separate, like, you, from a conceptual perspective, they can be the same variable. And that's what allows you to kind of just just construct a very simple algorithm where you take a latent state model and you just add the reward.
Yeah, but at the same time, maybe it's not a drawback because you don't necessarily know in real life when your task starts and ends. So in principle, you should kind of always be ready to vary your task variable as well in some sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think this, and especially when you're running on a real system, it's really nice to be able to, as soon as you know the task, to just be able to switch to doing the task. And if the task changes during an episode, you can immediately adapt to that.
Cool, thanks. So we now have some more questions. So I'm going to invite Fariba on screen. Let's see if she can come online. So Fariba, I've just sent an invite. If you can come online, if not, I'll just ask the question for you. And okay, so maybe I can just ask. So, okay, now we have. Fariba.
Hello, thanks, Kate, for a lovely talk. I was wondering the part that you showed with the dog with the hat. So you had these features that you have selected. You showed some of them with white dots and some with black dots. I was wondering, how do you mix these two features? Because the white dots represented the dog and the black dots represented the background. So how do you mix these two? Like, how do you give those as inputs to your model?
Yeah. Let's see. So the short, I'm not sure if I can find. Oh yeah, here we go. I can get the slide back. So we don't mix. So what we do is we construct a prototype for each class. So here we go. Here's the slide. All right. So the positive annotations which pick out the dog, right? We mask those on the image features, and then we pool or average, and so that gives us this prototype for a dog feature. And then for the negative or the background features, we do the same thing, independently, and that gives us a feature for the background. And then the way that we use both of those in the segmentation is dead simple. We just tile them, so we just repeat each feature for across the spatial cells of the new input. So here you can see, right, we just tile them, and then we just concatenate them together. And this then the network figure out how to combine that information.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I'm inviting for the next question. I only see the name M. Jasmik. Let's see if we can have him or her on board as well.
Hi, Kate. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, so thank you very much for the talk. It was very, very fruitful and very engaging as well. My question is regarding the steps that you have to take that are additional on top of your standard gradient descent, which is the meta learning steps. So I've recently come across this paper that discusses that on a rather different task on classification, where they have a classifier that is working on top of another classifier, and they're training. I think the paper goes like meta classifier, something like that. So they had the issue with the meta learning task that it takes a lot of time to optimize, because it's essentially building on top of your standard training algorithm. So I wanted to ask, did you encounter any such problems while you were doing it, or perhaps what is your opinion on the whole aspect of it?
I guess first I would say, like the if you do multiple levels of the meta learning, then that I think would definitely get very computationally expensive very fast. In terms of just the kind of single level stuff that I've presented here, the meta training sample and just computational complexity is kind of a problem, because you have to now optimize across a whole set of tasks rather than from just one task, right? And so that in terms of just collecting the data, that's harder, and then also in terms of the optimization itself, it seems to be a harder optimization problem where you might have tasks kind of interfering with each other and making it harder to learn. So as an example, here in these tasks, for the meta RL stuff, for example, the returns I'm showing here are not nearly as good as what you would get if you were just optimizing for one task. So for example, the humanoid returns here, the humanoid is kind of barely able to walk, and if you train it in a single task, it's actually able to kind of run around, right? So yeah, I think the optimization difficulties of meta training, especially in RL, are tricky. And there's been a little bit of, I think that's kind of a problem that people are starting to focus on, and even just starting in the context of multitask learning, which is kind of a simplification of meta learning, but has the same issues of task interference.
I see. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Okay, so looks like we have no more questions. Anyone else want to go ahead and ask? Okay, so if not, we'll thank Kate again. Thanks a ton, Kate. Yeah, we have some virtual claps as well. And so, yeah, that's it from our side, and looking forward to seeing you again at further Sheffield ML seminars. Okay, cheers. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.